Good afternoon, and it's my pleasure to bring to you this section and session on the upcoming spectrum auction, which we believe will probably happen towards the first part of September of this year. Yesterday, the government made its announcement in terms of the approval of the cabinet, which is the highest government body. So with that, let me begin the presentation. And what I would like to do, first of all, is to contextualize the spectrum auction in terms of what to expect and what are the needs that it is particularly focused on achieving. So the first slide that you will see is presently what is the telecom sector's contribution to the present government and the whole country. So first of all, you will notice the contribution to the Indian economy. We have over 500,000 villages covered. That's pretty much 85% of rural coverage based on the number of villages that we have. We contribute about 6.1% of India's GDP, and we contribute directly to 22 lakh jobs and indirectly to 20 lakh jobs. We are the second largest private sector investment in infrastructure. We've contributed and invested about 850,000 crore rupees in this sector. We are the highest contributors to government revenues. We contribute almost 70,000 crore rupees per annum. And we have brought in the highest amount of FDI in the last decade to India. And we, in spite of all of these large investments, provide one of the lowest voice rates anywhere in the world. If you look at our next slide, this is the snapshot of where we are today. Our population is at about 1.26 billion. We have about 300 million internet users or so. We have about 134 active social media users, and our mobile subscriptions, our subscribers or connections, are basically a little north of 1 billion connections. If you look at where we are in terms of the critical initiatives of the government, you'll notice that there are several. First of all is the broadband initiative of the government. The government wants to ensure that by the year 2020 or so, we have as many of our population connected to the internet and broadband. So the target is 600 million by 2020. And by the way, broadband definition is today defined by TRAI, which is the regulator, at 2 megabits per second, for speed, and 2 megabits in terms of the quantum that is available for use. And we have 155 million as of April 2016 against the target of 600 million. So that means we have to put on almost 8 million subscribers a month. We are nowhere near that number. And so the intention is just to show you the gaps and the challenges that we have to meet and how spectrum fits into meeting these challenges. If you look at BharatNet, BharatNet is the government initiative to provide connectivity through fiber network, because we believe that as these villages and urban areas get connected to the broadband, utilization and demand is going to go extremely high, and so therefore the fiber optic network is going to be critical to carry the amount of data and traffic that will be carried on our networks. And so we are expecting that 20,000 villages will be covered by March 2015. So that number is already passed. We are not there as yet, so we have about 7,000 villages that we will have to cover every month to get to the BharatNet target of connecting 250,000 villages by 2017 through fiber. Smart cities is another major initiative of the government. We have 100 cities targeted, and we are to make those cities smart by 2020. And the list of the first 20 cities have been announced, and only now are we seeing initial activities in some of these cities, and so we have a long ways to go. We need to cover 80 cities in addition to these 20 cities that have been identified. So this is the scope of the challenge that the industry has to meet. Again, if you look at the investments that are required to connect the 1 billion broadband subscribers that the government would ultimately like to connect, you'll notice that the total number that we're looking at in terms of cost is 607,000 crore rupees, right? That's the extreme right column, and it's broken down to saying that we will have to invest about 410,000 crore rupees in spectrum. If you look at our network, we will have to invest about 60,000 crore rupees in our towers and base stations. The optical fiber network is going to cost us about 25,000 crore rupees. Microwave connectivity, 112,000 or so crore rupees, for a total of 607,000 crore rupees. So this is just based on those assumptions that you see for operators operating with 5 megahertz of pan-India, 700 megahertz, 1000 megahertz, 900 megahertz, and 1800 megahertz spectrum. All right, so this is the cost that we are looking at in order to meet connecting the next 1 billion broadband subscribers. Where are we today in terms of the industry's financial health? And you see the figures over here. We are quite stressed in terms of our debt percentages. If you look at the extreme right column, net debt to EBITDA, about 3.9 times, all right, which is our estimate. And so again, we have about 383,000 crore rupees of debt, all right, and so again, that is a significant amount of debt that is on the books right now. If you look at our figures, it shows 270,599 crores. That is expected to grow up to 380 because of the amounts of money that we have already committed to acquiring spectrum. So that number of 270 will be going up to 380. So that's presently the number of debt that we're looking at in terms of the industry. So clearly not a whole lot of headroom available to us to be able to raise finances in the debt market to be able to fund some of these initiatives that we will be asked to finance from the government. Next, please. If you look at spectrum allocation in India, which is really the critical issue of discussion today, we have to contextualize this again because in India, the mobile network is the principal network that we have to carry all of our broadband traffic. In the rest of the world, you'll notice that there are at least 5 networks on which broadband connectivity is provided. So you have your broadband network provided over landline. You have it obviously on the mobility side. You have it in satellite, through satellite networks. You have it through cable networks. And you have it through private networks set up by industries or even by government, which has its own protocols and requirements. So at least 5 major networks that pick up the traffic demand. In India, we only have one major network, which is the mobile network. And since the mobile network is principally dependent on spectrum for what we call the last mile, spectrum becomes a critical blocking factor, if you will, bottleneck that will demand the success of how the industry meets these initiatives that the government would like us to achieve. Next, please. If you look at the spectrum holdings in different bands, this is presently how it stacks up against the various operators. All of our operators have principally spectrum in the 800, 900, 1800, 2100, and some of them, at least 2 major operators, have it in the 2300. So this is where we are presently. If you look at the whole industry, we have about 2,772 megahertz of spectrum pan-India, all right, across all of the various operators, and this gives you the breakdown. This is the amount of money that the industry has already invested in spectrum through the various auctions. The first top of the chart shows you the spectrum that was acquired through the preceding auctions, and most of those auctions, other than the one that you see in May 10, which is the 2100 megahertz and the 23 megahertz, that was really the only time fresh spectrum was put on sale. The other spectrum auctions identified as November 12th, March 13th, February 14th, March 15th, were principally reacquisition of spectrum already held by operators. Licenses expired after 20 years, and much of the spectrum was put back for sale and reacquired by the existing operators. Now, when you look at the bottom of the worksheet, you'll notice that this is the new band of spectrum that is being put up for sale. This is truly the fresh one, apart from the earlier 2300. So in the upcoming auction, we see that there's 700 megahertz, about 770 megahertz of spectrum there, 800, about 100 megahertz, very limited amounts of 900 and 1800, some leftover amounts from previous auctions. Most of it is non-contiguous, so not very useful for LTE. Then you have the 21 megahertz, 23 megahertz, and 25 megahertz. And so you'll notice that if all of that spectrum was to be sold in this upcoming auction, the government would raise 536,000 crore rupees. Now, you have to put that into context. So 536,000 crore rupees compared to the annual revenue of the industry. The revenue of the industry today is 250,000 crore rupees. So this outflow, if 100% of the upcoming spectrum that is to be auctioned is in fact acquired at the reserve price, it would be double of what the industry presently earns as revenue. Obviously, we can't devote 100% of our revenue to the acquisition of the spectrum. Go back, please. We can't dedicate 100% of our revenue to the acquisition of this new spectrum. So about 30% at best of our annual revenue can go towards funding this large amount of 500,000. So you can do the math. If we have to only take 30% of 250,000 crore rupees, the payback is at least 6 and 7 years out just to break even in terms of the amount of money. So you can begin to see the financial challenges relative to the amounts of money that will have to be spent on the spectrum. Next, please. So this is the pricing of spectrum in India versus other parts of the world. And right in the middle, you'll see India sticking out like a sore thumb at $33, right? This is US dollars, principally in the 1800, 900 megahertz spectrum, 800 megahertz spectrum. These are the principal bands that are today being used for either 2G, 3G, or 4G. Obviously, 2300 is also being used, but that is in the process of being rolled out. So again, as a comparative measure, you will see that India pays far and away more per megahertz of spectrum than anywhere else in the world. And so the reference point that we again want to highlight for our hearers is that in India, our operators pay almost 30% more than global prices for spectrum. The same price as global players pay for network, because India unfortunately imports 90% of its equipment, network equipment. But yet when you compare the revenue, the average revenue per user internationally is somewhere around 74 to 75 US dollars compared to $3 in India. So again, you can see the substantial financial challenge that operators in India have. So next, please. Again, this is will challenge your eyesight, but it's available for you. Again, this shows you by state the amount of spectrum that is available in each of the bands that is being proposed to be put up. Again, you'll notice that 700 obviously is the band that is quite advantageous. It gives you the maximum amount of bandwidth. 800 somewhat less, 900 to 1800 hardly anything, 2100 obviously the big chunk of change there. 1800 again will be augmented. We expect that some additional spectrum will be coming up in 1800 because of the freeing up of 1800 spectrum by the defense forces. 2300 will be of interest again, as you see. Not a whole lot of interest in the 25, although there's a whole lot of bandwidth available in 2500 megahertz spectrum. Unfortunately, the ecosystem in that band has not been developed all that much, so we don't expect a whole lot of interest in the 25 megahertz band. Although there's plenty of bandwidth in the 700, and that is an extremely attractive band because of its propagation characteristics for operators. Unfortunately, the price associated with the 700 megahertz spectrum is phenomenally high, and therefore a great disincentive for operators to acquire. At the bottom, you will see the pricing for 700 megahertz. Excuse me, if you want a pan-India 5 megahertz band, which is the bare minimum to offer LTE service, so if you acquired 5 megahertz pan-India of 700, you would be paying 57,000 crore rupees for just 5 megahertz. That is extremely high. In the other bands, it's much lower, and that's why we believe that the interest in the upcoming auction will be in the 1800 and the 2100, the 2300 bands. This again is the auction supply. If you look at the 700 megahertz, that's the largest chunk. So if you look at the existing megahertz of supply and the upcoming spectrum quantum is almost 50% more than what we have today. So it's almost a doubling of the presently held spectrum that operators have. So that's the good news story, that for the first time, the upcoming auctions will give us more than enough spectrum, so we are not any longer constrained on the supply side, as was the case in previous auctions. Next. So this again will show you on the extreme right, you'll see the quantum, because of the large amount of 700 megahertz spectrum that's coming online, the quantum of spectrum that is becoming available is pretty high. All right. So spectrum pricing is going to be crucial for success of the auctions, because why? It's the lifeline of the mobile telephony business. Accounts for 60% of the capex in India. All right, increasingly because of these high prices, more and more of the investments we make goes towards funding our acquisition of spectrum. And the upcoming auctions clearly is going to be the biggest if all of the auctioned spectrum is to be acquired. Even if it isn't, the government is expecting at least 60,000 crore rupees in this fiscal year as per their budget. The finance ministry put out its budget, and as per those numbers, approximately 60,000 crores expected from these auctions, which is a relatively large number. And so the government yesterday in its announcement termed it a big bang auction, and obviously we have to ask ourselves what is the appetite from the operator side. Next please. So look at this slide, which basically says we'll have to make massive investments to the tune of 5 lakh crores in order to just meet the government's initiatives. And if we have to create a financially sustainable industry, we have to support Digital India. We have to support broadband for all, which is to connect the next 1 billion. We have to support the BharatNet rollout of the fiber network. We have to support the 100 Smart Cities initiative, and we have to make M-governance and Make in India and these additional initiatives of the government, which principally will ride on our mobile network. We have to provide bandwidth for all of this and ensure connectivity in the rural areas. So one of the requirements that obviously is necessary is affordability of the spectrum, which is our chief input. If you continue to push up the price of our major input, then one should expect that at some point much of that is going to have to roll back out as uptick in terms of pricing. In no industry can continue to absorb increased costs without at some point having to push that out in terms of additional tariffs. So that is the danger if we have to continue to start paying these exorbitantly high prices for spectrum. So high bidding correlates with obviously higher investments, and if more funds are used to pay for spectrum, there's that much less money left to invest in our networks. And that is probably why we are seeing some of our challenges today in terms of call quality, drop calls, and that type of problems we face. So what's our recommendations? We're saying is that, listen, the industry is definitely under substantial financial pressure. So we ought to be looking at specialized financing options. If you looked at the government of India's recommendations over the past few days, excuse me, you'll notice that the government has rolled out all kinds of initiatives and all kinds of incentives for various sectors, be it defense, be it textiles. All of these industries receive substantial benefit. Unfortunately, we saw little of it coming towards telecommunications, and we think that is a mistake. I think there's plenty of opportunity to provide tax-free bond opportunities, tax holidays, specialized banks for funding these infrastructure initiatives because of the high upfront costs, the long gestation periods. So clearly providing for interest rates at subsidized rates. Clearly those are obvious financial options that will help with the financial situation of the industry. The reduction and elimination of license fees and SUC charge, spectrum usage charge. If you recollect, the government in about 2001, when it went to revenue share, when operators were unable to meet their commitments for upfront payments, the government in its wisdom allowed the industry to go to revenue share, which is a pay-as-you-go scheme. And that is when license fees and spectrum usage charges to the tune of about 15 to 18% was introduced. Now that spectrum auctions have been introduced, the industry is paying for it upfront. So therefore we see this continuing extraction of license fees and SUC as much of an anomaly, which really should have been done away with because you're paying upfront for the spectrum. And we are hoping that over time, the license fee and spectrum usage charge will begin to start going down to nominal values, leaving more funds with the industry to invest in the infrastructure and the rollout and customer service issues. So again, one of the areas is reduction in Universal Service Obligation Fund. The USO fund is 5%. If you look at our license fee, it's 8%. So 5% of that 8%, is comprised of the USO fund. The reason we say it should be eliminated is because in our NIA, which is the document that defines what we do after we buy the spectrum, there are very heavy requirements for penetrating rural areas as per our license requirements. So if we are required to penetrate as part of our license and for what we pay, there's little justification for asking for another 5% as a levy for the Universal Service Obligation Fund. So the other thing that we said is that in the rest of the world, when spectrum is sold, it's usually sold in perpetuity. That means you get to keep it, you pay for it once, and you get to keep it. Here, every 10, 20 years, we're asked to rebid for some of the spectrum, which continuously takes large chunks of resources out of the pockets of the industry. We can also, in our auctions, we don't have to go for the highest bidder. There are other alternative winning criteria. For example, fastest rollout to rural areas. That has been used in many African countries like Nigeria, where you recognize that continuing to ask the industry to be the highest bidder is not necessarily in the interest of nation building. Obviously, we need to start introducing new technologies, and we're doing that. Shared access spectrum, LTE-U, spectrum harmonization, are all things that we are working on, and we have the support of the government to initiate. So thank you, that is it. So we're open to questions at this point.
We are now beginning with the question and answer session. The first question is from Mr. Krishna Bhagwan. Is it really financially viable to acquire spectrum amid fierce competition and price target and possibility of sustainable business?
So, Krishnan, I think first of all, we really don't have an option, because if we are going to continuously meet the demands of our customers, the amount of spectrum that is going to have to be used to meet the surging demand for data consumption is going to require us to acquire more and more spectrum. Let me just again benchmark that. In countries, even with 4 and 5 networks in place, mobile operators have about 45 to 50 megahertz of spectrum per operator. In India, at present, before the new auction comes into place, we have somewhere between 15 and 18 megahertz of spectrum with this large population and population density. So there's no option but to have to acquire additional spectrum as we go forward. Question that you raise is, can we continue to pay these high prices? I don't think that that is going to be a sustainable option unless there's significant changes in the tariff regime. And this is what we point out. If the government of India continues to extract these large amounts from the industry, then ultimately the people who suffer are the consumers, who will end up having to pay for greater amounts of money to enjoy the services that they have and demand.
Anup Maheshwari asks, why is the spectrum price relatively on the higher side in India? Is there a business case where a cheaper spectrum coupled with additional tax revenue, infra spend, etc. justifies it in favor of the government?
So Anupam, I think the way forward, I think, is a couple of data points that have to be recognized. One of, first of all, is that the Supreme Court in India has mandated that all spectrum, all natural resources be auctioned. So by definition, we don't have an alternative except auctioning spectrum. However, as I indicated, the winning criteria for auctions does not necessarily always mean let's pick the highest bidder. There are instances when, in, for example, Sri Lanka, they stopped the auction when it went up to a certain price point. In Nigeria, they said, we are not going to pick the highest bidder, we will only pick the person who agrees to provide the fastest rollout of the network to rural areas. In other places, we've combined fast rollout to a certain level of tariff. So those combinations are ways in which in the bidding process, you minimize the outflow and allow the money that is ultimately to be paid for spectrum to come back into the industry and therefore to the benefit of the consumer. In India, if we continue this way of extracting more and more money because of spectrum, because of license fees, because of spectrum usage charges, and all of these other fees, I don't think that operators are going to be financially healthy enough to attract the large amounts of FDI and debt and perhaps even equity to sustain the business. So I think financial health of the industry is a real question mark going forward.
Anish Rajendran asks, amidst financial crisis, how do you feel that penetration of rural market is possible when 60% of capex of operator is charged for spectrum? What do you suggest from the government?
So Anish, if you see the types of debates that have been going on in terms of net neutrality, free basics, and all of these matters, the challenge that we have in terms of connecting the next 1 billion clearly has to do with a multiple set of factors. One is obviously the government investing in the national optical fiber network, what we call BharatNet. So the government has picked up some part of the investment requirement. Otherwise, clearly the industry would have had to invest on fiber. And it's a rather large amount that is invested. So the industry is now having to be faced with this challenge of rolling out our mobile network into the rural areas and providing the bandwidth and the speeds that are necessary to ensure that the customer experience is a good one. Now, this is the area of challenge, and this is where we continuously work with the government, and we say, look, there are ways that the government, without hurting its revenue stream, can reduce certain levies to the industry. I mentioned the fact that the license fee, the spectrum usage charge, which is off the top to the extent of about 15, that could be slowly done away with, because we believe that once that money comes back into the industry, gets reinvested, will drive revenue growth, and increased revenue growth will continue to provide additional tax money to the government, which in the long term will make up for any reductions that they have given to the industry. So I think this is the way forward in terms of how the industry has to be sort of helped forward. Now, you will notice how the textile industry in India went through its challenge. We've seen how the aviation industry in India has gone through its turbulence period. So all industries have gone through this, and now the once successful telecom industry is now getting into a phase where, because of this resources in terms of, already you've seen many companies leave. Videocon has exited the business. Telenor has pulled back substantially, become a regional player. All right, 2 other companies have left. ETTelecom left, the country. So we have to be very careful in terms of how we manage this industry going forward.
Next question is from Pooja. How a flat spectrum usage charge will really help telcos? Cabinet has deferred decision on it. What will be your next move?
So we are hoping, if you look at, Pooja, if you look at what was the original recommendation of the TRAI about 2+ years ago when the auctions was being held, the then TRAI chairman said that, listen, there's no particular reason to be charging 5 and 6 and 8% for spectrum usage charge when you're asking operators to pay upfront. So therefore, their recommendation was reduce it immediately to 3%, and then in a gliding path, reduce it to 1% flat. So that is going to be a pretty beneficial move if the TRAI comes back with that recommendation and the government adopts it. So we'll have to wait to see what the government does. If it does not, then again, the financial challenges to the industry remain. Now, we can do the math. If you have 2.5 lakh crore rupees as the income of the industry, sometimes a saving of 2 and 3% is a material amount of savings that can go back into the investments in network.
Harpreet Singh asks, how will such extremely exorbitant prices of spectrum justify once internet beaming satellite services like Facebook are launched?
So I think these spectrum prices being at these levels, fortunately in India, we have a very robust competitive landscape. You won't see this anywhere in the rest of the world, where there are at least 8 companies competing for your dollars or your money, your rupees. So that kind of ensures that most companies don't have a whole lot of control to be able to push up the end user tariffs. So because of those competitive prices, India has enjoyed one of the lowest voice tariffs. We expect that that will continue even in the data regime. We know that RIL is going to start its operations pretty shortly. We see fierce competition already happening. So we expect that data prices as a result will continue to stay relatively muted. So therefore, what happens is that the pressure that is on the margins will continue to remain with the industry. And so therefore, that's why the industry is very concerned about the continuous taking out of resources from the industry by the government.
Why there is no dialogue between the telecom industry and the government to have this issue of very high spectrum prices resolved? This issue is right from the time of telecom privatization. Is something being done regarding this by Satyavrata Tripathi?
Satyavrata, so that's a good point. Let me just quote a little bit of history here. We were, as an industry, almost in a similar situation in the year 1999, 2000. And all of these operators, and by the way, at that point, just about every global international operator was in India in partnership with a local operator. So you had the Swiss, you had the German, you had the American AT&T, you had Southwestern Bell from America, just about every major Deutsche Telecom from Germany. All of these companies were here in partnership. And they had bid substantially large amounts of money for the right to offer mobile services in all the various circles. However, by 1999, it became very obvious that just about every company had overbid. And companies were now shutting down, not rolling out, and were exiting the Indian telecom sector, so that the whole issue of liberalization was at risk. And then the Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, made a very courageous move. He was accused at that time of selling out to crony capitalists and creating big losses for the exchequer. But he took a very bold step. He said, listen, we believe that these liberalization effort is critical for the development of our country. And he went to revenue share. He said, listen, we're going to stop the one-time fee payment and we're going to go to revenue share. The fees that have been paid to date will be the benchmark amount to start off with, and then we'll go forward on a revenue share basis, and the revenue share will be comprised of a license fee component and a spectrum usage charge component. So my point in this is that history has shown us that when an industry gets into trouble, either because of its own problems of overbidding, and by the way, some of the bidding for spectrum is of our own making. We had to overbid because of the limited amount of spectrum and having been forced to buy back our own business. Because of those challenges, the government is now in a situation where they have to look at alternatives. Are we in dialogue with the government? Absolutely. What is the challenge for the government? I think the government itself is in a very delicate balancing situation financially today. As you well know, the banks have a big challenge in terms of non-performing assets. The global financial situation is not all that stable. India, although doing well, is on a bit of a razor's edge in terms of how things go. So the government itself does not want to jeopardize its revenue stream, does not want to jeopardize the current account deficit situation, and so as a result, it is being very cautious. We hope that if things improve, growth story continues, the government gets into a healthier financial situation, that the government will now begin to address again, and quickly, I hope, the issues of the financial plight of our industry.
Next question is from Deepak Bachu. Why do you think the government has turned down the request to bring down base price for 700 megahertz spectrum, although global figures are available?
So first of all, although some global figures are available for 700, the technology used for 700 is a bit different. 700 is used in the USA, Verizon uses it, and some other countries do use 700, but they use a different technology. We use a different FDD technology here in India, and we obviously have never auctioned 700 megahertz spectrum, which is why the government and TRAI benchmark 700 on an efficiency factor basis. Previously, and this is not any different, when other bands, so for example 2300 megahertz spectrum was not sold previously, you benchmarked it. So we would say, look, 800 is twice as efficient as 1800. And so what happened was 700 was benchmarked as 4 times as efficient as 1800. Now, why did we pick 1800? Because we had benchmark auction market determined prices for just about every circle because of the prior bidding of 1800 spectrum. So therefore, the TRAI, in its wisdom, decided that 4 times that price is what would be the worth of the 700 megahertz spectrum. We in the industry kind of disagree with that methodology because we say, look, the context in which 1800 megahertz spectrum was sold, the market conditions under which it was sold, is very different then than it is today. Then we were shortchanged for spectrum. We were bidding back for our own life, if you will. this is a business continuity issue, and so therefore people were willing to pay just about anything to get it back. Things have changed. We have an abundance of spectrum, so therefore to use the same 4 times we think is erroneous, and that's what's led to this high number that is being used for 700. So unfortunately, it appears that the cabinet has agreed to this number, so we'll have to wait to see what happens in this auction.
Khurshid asks, how do you see industry positioning post-SEP spectrum auction? What is likely fate of 700 megahertz rollout?
Before we get to the rollout of 700, one will have to see how much of 700 is acquired. So there's about 100 megahertz of spectrum available, about 35 megahertz in each circle, as you saw in our chart. And so we expect that because of the high prices, there will be very limited demand for 700. There will be a few circles, some what we call C circles, perhaps a place like Bihar or some such, where the pricing of 700 is still not too bad. But certainly the pricing of 700 in the metro areas, in the A circles, in some of the major city LSAs, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Punjab, Kerala, all of those cities, the pricing is so high that just about any present operator would find it difficult to make a business case for acquiring that and rolling out networks. So we believe that the demand will be principally in the 1800 area, the 2100 area, and the 2300 area, where existing operators will want to fill in their gaps right now based on their present spectrum holdings. And that's where we will see the demand as we go forward. Probably not much on the 700.
Bharat Kumar Gupta asks how the spectrum auction is going to fill gap between depth of telecom operators and government income.
So, first of all, the moment you decide that you want to buy spectrum and you bid for spectrum, you're stuck, right? Because if you remember the spectrum process, you have to put a certain down payment upfront in order to actually go into the bidding process and bid for spectrum. So once you put up your money, you're committed. Once you put up your money, it means that you have somehow arranged for financing of some type, either on your own. The government itself is offering financing, by the way. So they say that, look, we will give you a 10-year period in which to pay the debt that you may incur for buying the spectrum. You'll have to put 50% up front. The rest of the 50% will be spread over 10 years. So that is a financing mechanism. You, of course, will have to pay the going rate, which is at 9% or so, which again is not a very attractive rate because it's almost a street level interest. So how will that gap be filled? The gap will be filled by obviously consuming less. When you can't afford the amount of food that you would like to eat, you obviously alternatively limit the amount of food that you can afford to eat. So that's going to be the trade-off. So in the upcoming auctions, we don't see a whole lot of the spectrum being acquired, especially in the 700 band. And so that's how the operators, I think, will compensate for the high prices.
Deepak Oswal asks, why do you think why in India it is limited spectrum while other countries are enjoying 20 megahertz spectrum per industry, while India is still struggling with 5 megahertz?
So one of the reasons is a historical reason, Deepak. If you look, pre-independence and post-independence, still certainly 1995, 96, when the sector was liberalized, all of the spectrum was held by government and was distributed by the government to its various government agencies. So all of the defense forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, now of course the Coast Guard, Air Traffic Control, Aeronautics, Police, DRDO, ISRO, which is the space, all of these agencies were given massive amounts of spectrum. Doordarshan, by the way, which is called All India Radio in those days, all of them had great amounts of spectrum that, since they were all privately run, held by the government, there was no discipline in terms of its holding, its utilization, the efficiency of its utilization. Once you got to the point when it began to have commercial value and could be used for providing communication services, the game changed. Unfortunately, trying to get this vast amount of spectrum from the hands of the defense and the space and all of these other agencies is not an easy issue, because a lot of the equipment that is used by the military and the Air Force and the aeronautics people use existing spectrum, in some of it in the 900 band, some of it in the 800 band, and some of the other bands that are there that we mentioned. So slowly getting it out is becoming a laborious process. And again, kudos to the minister and the DOT secretary. In this go around, they were able to really extricate a big chunk of 1800 megahertz spectrum, which was being held by defense for the last 3 years and not being utilized at all. So that's been the challenge that we face in India.
Sailesh Gaur wants to ask, why can't spectrum allocation be coverage and expansion oriented for benefiting better customer experience, as 700 megahertz is more friendly to cover large outdoor geography, and 1800 megahertz and 2100 and 2300 for indoor?
So if you look at it, Sailesh, we are going to what we call heterogeneous networks, right? That is already part of what we do and part of the technology. And what is heterogeneous networks? Heterogeneous networks are the simultaneous use of multiple bands. And obviously now we are a band agnostic. If you look at our technology and if you look at our networks, we no longer say 1800 and 900 can only be used for GSM 2G, 2100 is 3G, 2300 is 4G, 800 is CDMA, and all of this. We're saying is that now all bands can be used for 4G, LTE, and ultimately for 5G. So nobody is going to acquire spectrum and start investing in obsolete 2G technology. It's all going to be the 3G, and it's going to work on all of these bands. So yes, already the technology is moving to where we are band agnostic, and we will buy whatever bands are available at whatever prices we can afford, and then utilize those for rolling out 4G networks, which is really what our customers are demanding for speeds and customer experience. Now, coming back to the issue of 700, the lower part of the spectrum is obviously the more advantageous for two reasons. One, its propagation characteristics means that the wavelengths travel further and can penetrate buildings. So yes, we would like to acquire it, but unfortunately, the affordability factor kicks in. So yes, we'd all like to have the best of meals, whatever it is that we like to eat. But if it's unaffordable, there's going to be leftover onions. At 300 rupees per kilo will mean that there's plenty of onions left over, even if there's a plentiful supply. So there's always this supply-demand equation. And unfortunately, because of the high price that's been established, even though the industry would benefit and ultimately customers would benefit from us utilizing 700, it would mean fewer towers, better service. Unfortunately, the government doesn't seem to have decided to manage the pricing of this very well.